hear rather misleading things," replied the captive grimly. "I suppose I did break down a bit and lose my temper and talk to myself, but I have some sense of honour for all that." "Some sense of honour?" repeated Rupert, and the last light of intelligence died out of his face, leaving it the face of an idiot with rolling eyes. He moved vaguely towards the door, and I followed. But I turned yet once more in the toils of my conscience and curiosity. "Can we do nothing for you, madam?" I said forlornly. "Why," said the lady, "if you are particularly anxious to do me a little favour, you might untie the gentleman upstairs." Rupert plunged heavily up the kitchen staircase, shaking it with his vague violence. With mouth open to speak, he stumbled to the door of the sitting-room and scene of battle. "Theoretically speaking, that is no doubt true," Mr. Burrows was saying, lying on his back and arguing easily with Basil, "but we must consider the matter as it appears to our sense. The origin of morality—" "Basil," cried Rupert, gasping, "she won't come out." "Who won't come out?" asked Basil, a little cross at being interrupted in an argument. "The lady downstairs," replied Rupert. "The lady who was locked up. She won't come out, and she says that all she wants is for us to let these fellows loose." "And a jolly sensible suggestion," cried Basil, and with a bound he was on top of the prostrate Burrows once more, and was unknotting his bonds with hands and teeth. "A brilliant idea. Swinburne, just undo Mr. Greenwood." In a dazed and automatic way I released the little gentleman in the purple jacket, who did not seem to regard any of the proceedings as particularly sensible or brilliant. The gigantic Burrows, on the other hand, was heaving with Herculean laughter. "Well," said Basil in his cheeriest way, "I think we must be getting away. We have so much enjoyed our evening. Far too much regard for you to stand on ceremony. If I may so express myself, we've made ourselves at home. Good night. Thanks so much. Come along, Rupert." "Basil," said Rupert desperately, "for God's sake, come and see what you can make of the woman downstairs. I can't get the discomfort out of my mind. I admit that things look as if we had made a mistake. But these gentlemen won't mind, perhaps." "No, no," cried Burrows, with a sort of Rabelaisian uproariousness. "No, no. Look in the pantry, gentlemen. Examine the coal-hole. Make a tour of the chimneys. There are corpses all over the house, I assure you." This adventure of ours was destined to differ in one respect from others which I have narrated. I had been through many wild days with Basil Grant, days for the first half of which the sun and the moon seemed to have gone mad. But it had almost invariably happened that towards the end of the day and its adventure, things had cleared themselves like the sky after rain, and a luminous and quiet meaning had gradually dawned upon me. But this day's work was destined to end in confusion, worse confounded. Before we left that house, 10 minutes afterwards, one half-witted touch was added, which rolled all our minds in a cloud. If Rupert's head had suddenly fallen off on the floor, if wings had begun to sprout out of Greenwood's shoulders, we could scarcely have been more suddenly stricken. And yet of this we had no explanation. We had to go to bed that night with the prodigy, and get up next morning with it, and let it stand in our memories for weeks and months. As will be seen, it was not until months afterwards that by another accident, and in another way, it was explained. For the present, I only state what happened. When all 5 of us went down the kitchen stairs again, Rupert leading, the 2 hosts bringing up the rear, we found the door of the prison again closed. Throwing it open, we found the place again as black as pitch. The old lady, if she was still there, had turned out the gas. She seemed to have a weird preference for sitting in the dark. Without another word, Rupert lit the gas again. The little old lady turned her bird-like head as we all stumbled forward in the strong gaslight. Then, with a quickness that almost made me jump, she sprang up and swept a sort of old-fashioned curtsy or reverence. I looked quickly at Greenwood and Burrows, to whom it was natural to suppose this subservience had been offered. I felt irritated at what was implied in this subservience, and desired to see the faces of the tyrants as they received it. To my surprise, they did not seem to have seen it at all. Burrows was paring his nails with a small penknife. Greenwood was at the back of the group, and had hardly entered the room. And then an amazing fact became apparent. It was Basil Grant who stood foremost of the group, the golden gaslight lighting up his strong face and figure. His face wore an expression indescribably conscious, with the suspicion of a very grave smile. His head was slightly bent with a restrained bow. It was he who had acknowledged the lady's obeisance, and it was he, beyond any shadow of reasonable doubt, to whom it had really been directed. "So I hear," he said, in a kindly yet somehow formal voice, "I hear, madam, that my friends have been trying to rescue you, but without success." "No one, naturally, knows my faults better than you," answered the lady with high colour, "but you have not found me guilty of treachery." "I willingly attest it, madam," replied Basil, in the same level tones. "And the fact is that I am so much gratified with your exhibition of loyalty that I permit myself the pleasure of exercising some very large discretionary powers. You would not leave this room at the request of these gentlemen, but you know that you can safely leave it at mine." The captive made another reverence. "I have never complained of your injustice," she said. "I need scarcely say what I think of your generosity." And before our staring eyes could blink, she had passed out of the room, Basil holding the door open for her. He turned to Greenwood with a relapse into joviality. "This will be a relief to you," he said. "Yes, it will," replied that immovable young gentleman, with a face like a sphinx. We found ourselves outside, in the dark blue night, shaken and dazed, as if we had fallen into it from some high tower. "Basil," said Rupert at last, in a weak voice, "I always thought you were my brother. But are you a man? I mean, are you only a man?" "At present," replied Basil, "my mere humanity is proved by one of the most unmistakable symbols, hunger. We are too late for the theatre in Sloane Square, but we are not too late for the restaurant. Here comes the green omnibus." And he had leaped on it before we could speak. As I said, it was months after that Rupert Grant suddenly entered my room, swinging a satchel in his hand, and with a general air of having jumped over the garden wall, and implored me to go with him upon the latest and wildest of his expeditions. He proposed to himself no less a thing than the discovery of the actual origin, whereabouts, and headquarters of the source of all our joys and sorrows, the Club of Queer Trades. I should expand this story forever if I explained how ultimately we ran this strange entity to its lair. The process meant 100 interesting things: the tracking of a member, the bribing of a cabman, the fighting of roughs, the lifting of a paving stone, the finding of a cellar, the finding of a cellar below the cellar, the finding of a subterranean passage, the finding of the Club of Queer Trades. I have had many strange experiences in my life, but never a stranger one than that I felt when I came out of those rambling, sightless, and seemingly hopeless passages into the sudden splendour of a sumptuous and hospitable dining-room, surrounded upon almost every side by faces that I knew. There was Mr. Montmorency, the arboreal house-agent, seated between the two brisk young men who were occasionally vicars and always professional detainers. There was Mr. P.G. Northover, founder of the Adventure and Romance Society. There was Professor Chadd, who invented the dancing language. As we entered, all the members seemed to sink suddenly into their chairs, and with the very action the vacancy of the presidential seat gaped at us like a missing tooth. "The President's not here," said Mr. P.G. Northover, turning suddenly to Professor Chadd. "No," said the philosopher, with more than his ordinary vagueness. "I can't imagine where he is." "Good heavens!" said Mr Montmorency, jumping up. "I really feel a little nervous. I'll go and see." And he ran out of the room. An